When I was a kid, I was so sensitive to do as I say, not as I do. Folks that didn't seem to walk their talk. But I've had this terrible experience recently as someone who teaches undergraduates, where there are all these things that I never did as an undergraduate that I want them to do. I vividly remember when I was a student being like, why doesn't the professor understand that even though I missed the last 3 weeks of the term, that I was in the microfiche, right? For listeners who don't know what that is, it's little books filmed in some basement somewhere. And I was writing a 50-page paper and only 10 was due. Why is my professor not pleased? Right? I didn't get it till I was on the other side. What about you, Mem? Do you tell them to do things you don't do, or are you consistent?
I was a syllabus reader. I still am a syllabus reader. I'm like,
You're a syllabus. You were that kid?
I was that kid. I need every
You didn't
advantage.
admit this to me because I knew you as a teenager, and you didn't admit you were a syllabus reader. I don't know how that would have affected me.
Let's just say, particularly in business school, I was too terrified to not read the syllabus and not prepare because they would call on me, and it was horrible even when I was prepared. So why would I make it worse for myself by not being prepared?
There's logic in this, and it's not a bad segue into what we're going to talk about today, where we're going to talk about things that we probably should be prepared for and don't. But just to kind of make myself, just to tell exhibit some honesty here. I never read, and I am recognizing I'm saying this on the recording, so editors take this out for sure. I have never read a syllabus for any class I ever took, except maybe like in the last week, right? And yet I do a whole thing with courses where I say, you should read this syllabus, unlike I've been, and here's why.
I mean, I get that. I'm more like, you should read it because I did, and here I am. So, okay.
Yeah, so you're leading by example, and I don't know what. I'm drawing people along through being open about my hypocrisy, something like that.
Sure.
Yeah, I kind of like it in the middle there between the two of you. It's like if you can't sell the syllabus, you can't sell the class in the first paragraph, you've lost me. I'm not interested. So I'll read the first paragraph, and if it's interesting, then yeah, I'll add that one to the list. Otherwise, it's going to be a boring.
So you, Alister, do the intro to the syllabus, and that gets covered, and the rest is a fine print, as it were.
Yep, that's it.
But Mim, you read all the fine prints. You probably read like the little details about, what constitutes plagiarism at the end. My favorite. So in universities now, there's all this discussion of how you deal with students who are using ChatGPT or another tool to write their assignments. But my favorite take on this is in Richard Osman's new murder mystery, like the master murderer uses ChatGPT to write all his emails and disguise where he's from and who he is. It's definitely my favorite use of artificial intelligence so far.
I love it. I'm curious what our wonderful guest will say actually about artificial intelligence. But I'm going to give the folks at home a little bit of a background on who we have joining us today. So we have Alister Watt, and he is the Chief Product Officer for the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, what we'll refer to as IBHS. And it's an independent nonprofit scientific and research communications organization that's supported by reinsurers, by property insurers, and affiliated companies. So currently, they have about half of commercial property insurance sold in the US, if I understand this right, and roughly 3/4 of the residential property insurance. And the idea is that they're involved in building safety research. So how do business owners basically have more resilient property structures and communities?
I'm Alejandro Juárez Crawford. My co-host is Miriam Plavin-Masterman. And we're on a mission to make launching an experiment of your own or contributing to one as normal as watching videos on your phone. Welcome to What If Instead, the podcast. Now today, Mim, we have a chance to talk about a version of whether we read the syllabus in a sense through the lens of the insurance industry in the era of climate change.
That's right. Sometimes timing is your friend. We're just going to make some lemonade out of some real lemons. And I do not mean to downplay this at all, but for people listening in terms of our timing, we're relatively recent from horrible hurricane and that came up the East Coast and went inland and has really left a path of destruction up through North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Florida, among others. I just want to make sure that people are understanding kind of that's our timeline and our situation, because what Alister is working on is so important. And I think just the combination of that in the background will make it even more salient. So how did you get started in working in this area where you're actually working to prevent destruction by wind and wildfire? Because it's not a traditional path, but it's so interesting. How did you end up here?
So I'll give you the idealized version, then I'll give you the truth. The idealized version is that I was working in the mitigation space, and an opportunity came up. It was just a perfect fit for me. I applied and got the job. No, that's not what happened. I was working for the National Flood Insurance Program, FEMA, as a consultant, and the guy that ran that program at the time was Roy Wright. And so he was the chief executive of the National Flood Insurance Program. We were good friends. I called him because I was about to make a career change, and I just want to make sure that he still liked me and would give me a reference. And he said, sure. And actually, I have a prospectus I've been working on for a job. I'd really like your input on that, which was not uncommon for him to ask for as he's trying to perfect this document. So I get it, and we're still on the phone, and I'm reading it. I'm like, Roy, this reads like my resume. He said, oh, really? I said, would you like me to throw my hat in the ring? He said, I would love for you to throw your hat in the ring.
This is the greatest example of product market fit through happenstance, right? This reads like my resume. If it were just a line, it would be a great line, right? Alister, I love that you led off with the idealized version and the truth. And I'm tempted to take just a second for folks who are looking for an opportunity and just dwell on that, because we tell this story that is the idealized version, but it seldom really works that way, does it? It's much more like what you've described.
Yeah, it's all about introductions. If people trust each other, know something about each other, then you can get a little bit of a leg up. Timing is everything, right? You got to be in the right place at the right time and prepared.
And in your story, someone was presenting you with a problem that you were in a place to help solve, which I think is really intriguing.
Yeah. So so it's a great job, and thrilled to be part of IBHS. This is, I've worked as a consultant. You've worked with many different companies, and you go in, and sometimes the culture is interesting, but not in a good way, and sometimes it's interesting in a good way. IBHS falls into the interesting in a good way. You got people that are totally committed to a mission of preventing avoidable loss. That's their passion, and the people that stay here are the people that have that strong sense of grounding in what their purpose really is. And so, this is the first organization that I've ever worked in where I like everyone. There's not one person in this organization that I don't like and have something in common with. So, yeah, it was, I'm very glad that I called Roy asking him for a reference.
So, Mim, you know the org theory, but don't they need someone that Alister dislikes to, be their piggy from Lord of the Flies, like someone to harsh on? I mean, isn't that part of org theory, to find that person?
I mean, you don't always want the scapegoat or the villain. You don't want the person who eats everybody else's food in the company fridge. Like, you don't really want that person, right? So I'm delighted for him that he has such a wonderful work environment. I think it's great because I think the mission is really important, and like having a place where everybody's on the same page means you're just always pushing the mission forward.
So the fact that Alister's company will make a terrible mockumentary might even be a good thing for his mission. For sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which brings me to my next question. So I would love for you to talk a little bit about the wildfire prepared and the fortified programs, and how. And I guess I want to think of it in this context. Given that you're very closely involved with the insurance side, how do we think about the other piece of it, of like the demand for homeowners to ask for these programs, or for builders to build with these programs? Because to me, it seems like those are the other pieces of it.
Yeah, it's a great question. So let's take it back to the science and then wind it forward into the implementation of that. So our science is meticulous. We have a custom designed facility here in 99 acres in the middle of nowhere. If you find this place, it's because you took a wrong turn. And that's by design, because there's a lot of noise that's produced by 105 fans, each of which have 355 horsepower behind them. That's what you need in order to generate hurricane force winds inside a building, which is a crazy concept. So what we do on the wind side is we build houses, full-size houses. We build, if we're testing out a particular engineering design, we build the house with that engineering design implemented. And then alongside it, we'll put a typical house like you would see floating away in Hurricane Helene, right? And then we start exposing those structures to wind. And it's not just flip a switch and off you go and see what happens. These things are on turntables. We move them 10 degrees at a time. They get about 15 minutes of a wind pattern. That wind pattern, including all the ebbs and flows, is based on a real hurricane. So every time there's a hurricane, there are lots of people from Texas Tech and various other academic institutions and NGOs and some governmental weather organizations go out and take readings, set up their equipment, and they read the wind speeds at a particular point so you can develop the swath of the wind in a particular region. And then so every time we hit a building with wind, we're hitting it with a hurricane that actually happened.
So IBHS is doing the crash test dummy setup for homes in wind.
Yeah, the dummy doesn't survive though.
You could do great. I mean, maybe you could produce sort of like those driver's ed videos, right? That if you take the course, you lower your insurance. You guys could do that for home ownership.
Yeah. So the science is meticulous. It is irrefutable. You mentioned crash test dummies. That's our sister organization. That's IIHS, Institute for Highway Safety. So you've got building safety and you've got cars, automobiles, highway safety. Those are the two big not-for-profits that the insurance industry funds in the United States. So it's all state of the art. We are basically the authority on building safety from an engineering perspective.
Now, can we actually zero in on authority from an engineering perspective? Right, where you create the home with the wind resistance built in, and a phrase you used just when you were opening up about the science and the implementation.
So we'll test the science, right? And so we do side by side. We examine failure modes, things like do garage doors fail, under what conditions, what was the structure, what was the difference between the two buildings that were. Our hypothesis would be at this particular speed in this particular configuration, we would see a failure. That's what we're testing for. And so then we can figure out, okay, how do we fix that so that that vulnerability is mitigated? And so we go through this laborious process to figure all these things out. And then we codify all that into a standard. And so Mim mentioned the two programs that we have right now. One is the wind mitigation. It also includes hail, but it's primarily about wind, both from a hurricane perspective and from a severe convective storm that you would see in the Midwest and over towards the Rockies. So that's the fortified standard. So everything that we have researched that we have found to work that makes a structure stronger against wind is in that technical standard. So that's the blueprint for how you build. On the wildfire side, we have Wildfire Prepared Home. It is, perhaps people will understand this, but let me just put some numbers to it to draw a comparison between the wind vulnerability and the wildfire vulnerability. You've just seen Hurricane Helene, so it's fresh in mind. We've got some recency around this, and you've seen Take the image of houses floating away because there was inundation of water. That's a different problem. But you see houses where bits of the roof have been ripped off, shingles are missing from the roof, maybe a garage door's been punched in or whatever. The damage is not catastrophic. The damage is generally partial. In other words, yes, there can be catastrophic damage, of course. If a Category 5 hurricane comes in and hits you right bang on, you're not really going to have much of a chance there. But if it's a typical hurricane or storm and you're a little bit more inland where the wind speeds have slowed down a little bit because it's going over land, then you're going to see some damage, but not a total loss. generally speaking. And so the size of the claim to repair that house is smaller, right? Because you're repairing. And so put that there and then contrast that with wildfire. With wildfire, 90% of home ignitions are caused by embers. Embers flying through the air, landing on the ground, igniting something combustible, wicks its way to the house, and there you got a big old fire. Those type of losses, right? When a building is ignited, there's about a 90% chance it's going to be a total loss. But it's worse than that. Because if you look back in history, look at Coffey Park, look at Lahaina, look at any of the big wildfire events, the Camp Fire in 2018 is a horrible example of it, but it's pungent, but it really makes the point. It's not just one structure, it's the whole community. Once a structure is ignited, it produces structural embers that then, and the wind will blow the flames towards house. And we build houses pretty close to each other, especially in California. And so you end up with what's called a conflagration, which is a total loss not only of the house, but of the community. And so that size of problem is something that the insurance industry and homeowners really care about. And just to really underscore this, in 2018, when you look at all of the disasters that happened that the insurance industry paid out on, so Camp Fire, Hurricane Michael, the typhoon in Japan, Hurricane Florence, and the Woolsey Fire, those were the big events in 2018. The Camp Fire was the costliest disaster in 2018 globally.
Alister, I want to pick up on this point you're making about losing the house versus losing the community. I was just having breakfast with a friend of mine who's a longtime firefighter in Colorado, and she was showing me her own videos from the truck of one house lighting up, little blazes, the next house, and then these just waves of fire. Now, when things are changing, right, we know that we human beings are terrible, if it's not on the sample path we're used to, at relating to the risk, right? If I'm a trader and I've never experienced a financial crisis, I'm taking this from the book Fooled by Randomness, then it's very hard for me to imagine that my existing strategies aren't going to work. What I want to ask you is about how you create the incentives when things are changing to build in the right way and in the right places.
Yeah, it is the issue that keeps my team up every day on this. It's how do you get the message across in a way that is really effective? And I'm a little old school on this one. I like Smokey the Bear, but Smokey doesn't really kind of get in your face and tell you to do something. And when in wildfire, it's kind of like this. There's no partial credit. You either pass or you fail. And passing means you've done everything that you need to do to mitigate the risk. Embers will find the weak link. If you don't mitigate, if you don't pass the test, check all of the questions, get the right answer on each of those questions, you've just left a vulnerability that embers will exploit on a bad day.
So what I'm hearing is you need to treat the syllabus the way MIM does. You need to read the whole thing, not just the first paragraph. But seriously, I'll never forget this conversation a year ago with a friend from Japan and a friend from Turkey. And as you know, this was actually a couple years ago, there was a big earthquake in Turkey. And many of the Turkish buildings, even though they had the codes, were not built according to code. So they just collapsed in the earthquake.
Yep.
And the Japanese have been extremely stringent about the enforcement of what you just said. Build the whole thing right. And I was very intrigued by that difference and how that gets implemented throughout a society and a set of industries. So maybe you could pick up on Smokey the Bear ain't enough and talk us through what would it take for folks with properties in Florida or the Carolinas to change how we're experiencing these things?
Yeah, so the end result, the day that I no longer have a job and my partner, Dr. Ann Cope, our chief engineer no longer has a job. It's when we have building codes, strong building codes across the United States, enforced, inspected, and built carefully.
So for listeners, our goal is Alister joblessness. That's what we're really going
right.
for
I
here.
want to hand that prospectus back to Roy and say, job complete, thank you, I'm going to the beach. But that's
I'm
it.
going to live in a wind-protected, wildfire, well-designed building for hurricanes on the beach. Yeah.
So let's really take an example here that makes the point. What I'll tell you is, if you go to Lower Alabama, right? And I love the fact it's Lower Alabama because I get to talk about one of the states that's normally ranked at the bottom of tables, actually is right at the top. And they're right at the top because they have required, through a code supplement in the lower two counties of Alabama, that all structures be built to the fortified gold standard. So that's the structural standard. That's the ability to withstand hurricanes. And they are inspected. So it's one thing to have a code that says that thou shalt do X, Y, and Z. It's another for someone to come behind and say, did you actually do X, Y, and Z properly? Right? So you got to have both of those things in place. So Alabama, Lower Alabama, is an example of a strong building code that is enforced. Houses in that market, there's a report that came out, and I think it was updated last year, from the University of Alabama, which specifically looked at what was the value increase in the real estate from building to that standard, based on real houses, real sales. What was the percentage increase just from that alone? And I can't remember what the new number is, but the old number was 7%. So 7% increase. So not only does your house kind of be able to withstand the elements, you're actually getting an increase in your value too. Now that's the best example. And in Alabama, we have now about 50,000 structures that are built to that standard and certified. So there's a piece of paper that says IBHS says that this house was built to the standard correctly, and that's something that insurance companies will bank. Because it lowers the risk.
I feel as if you've given us a really interesting what if instead here. You teed this up talking about folks who are sensitive about saying something critical about enforcement in Texas, right? And of course, we all have the phrase in our heads, don't mess with Texas. But what you're doing here is very interesting. You're saying maybe we change our idea from don't criticize us to criticize our system of enforcement, think more about Alabama, so that we begin to not just have the code, but enforce the code. In other words, the what if instead perhaps is stop saying just don't say bad things about the way we're doing things. Instead, say a lot of criticism about the way we're doing things. So we actually, if we don't want to mess with Texas, we need to get it right.
Texas has now started to consider, should they be doing more in the code space? They've had a lot of hurricanes. Look at Harvey, look at other ones, that came in. And so there's a recognition there. And there is a fierce independence and thou shalt not tell me what to do that persists in that culture. You could build just a contrast, right? So Lower Alabama, fortified gold standard, certified to be there. In Texas, you could build a house out of matchsticks and tinfoil and you would be compliant with the code.
And culturally, this don't tell me what to do thing is really interesting. I mean, I have cabins in the woods. And for me, I'll admit this, I don't want anyone telling me my neighbor built an Adirondack fire tower against code at the edge of a cliff and tells this incredible story about how when the code person came and it was sort of a fait accompli, right? It was a done deal, like getting eventually the approvals and this sort of thing. I'm oversimplifying this story, but the point is, when I hear that story, I'm like, oh yeah, I can't believe they would have stopped you from building this tower in this amazing place, right? That's that fierce independence. How do you think about, right, when we have those values of don't tell me what to do, which I have very strongly, right? How do you think about, yeah, but we need to put some teeth in these things so we don't keep repeating these patterns that put whole communities at risk?
So carrot and stick. Personally, I like the stick. It's not to say there aren't good tasty carrots around, but they're a little harder to find, and not everyone likes carrots. One of the best examples ever of implementing mitigation in the United States, other than Smokey the Bear, which is probably one of the best, is seatbelts. So seatbelts were designed, the insurance industry and auto manufacturers agreed this was a good thing, and so they created these seatbelts. Their efficacy was measured by the insurance industry, IBHS, and the states were asked to adopt the enforcement of seatbelts, and they didn't. So the federal government brought out the stick and said, if you want funding for your highways, you're going to enforce seatbelt law. And that's how it happened. There was a credible, direct consequence on everyone if you didn't comply. Now, some people are going to say, libertarians, no, they're going to have some indigestion around that. I get it, but it is effective. And so
But you're asking what freedom is, aren't you? You're asking, is my freedom not to have a multi-car pileup where everybody dies, or in this case, a wildfire that knocks out the whole community? Because that's freedom. I want freedom not to have that wildfire. Or is my freedom to build against code like the Turkish builders that built the buildings that collapsed in the earthquakes? And it's very interesting what you've done, because I can care about my freedom, right? I can be fiercely independent, but we end up having to think about some things that affect my freedom in different ways.
Yeah, and so, that's the extreme example in terms of the stick. On the carrot side, just to give you a well-rounded view of this, I'll tell you a story about when I was in middle school in Scotland. And my French teacher, Mr. Payne, yes, that was his name, Mr. Payne.
Great name for a French teacher.
He, one afternoon, his brother was a psychologist. So one afternoon, he looked around.
He should have been Dr. Payne. Was his brother Dr. Payne? Because that's even better, just saying.
Yeah, let's go with that. So Dr. Payne looked around the class, and there was no energy in the classroom at all. And he's like, okay, I'll be real here. So he started talking about cigarette smoking. And so you got people that kids that are 11, 12 years old. So, and Mr. Payne's talking about how your parents are going to die because they smoke cigarettes. And there's a secondary effect on you too. And that's not a very considerate thing to be doing. So he went on about this for a whole period. And everyone was sitting there, you're 11, 12 years old and talking about death. And when you're recognizing something that your parents may do and directly connecting the things together, it was horrifying. Mm-hmm. Came back to our French lesson later in the week, and Dr. Payne, did say, okay, how many of you talked to your parents about cigarette smoking this week? What percentage of the class do you think that had parents that smoked cigarettes? What percentage do you think actually said, yes, I did talk with them about this? Take a guess.
I'm going to go with half.
63%.
Over 90%.
Wow.
Middle schoolers are magic because they're interested, they're curious, they like to talk, they're very connected with their parents. And so my theory is replicate Mr. Payne's experiment with Wildfire through middle schoolers, get the resources together for that basic education about how you mitigate wildfire, and get that into some small capsule that a middle school teacher can pick up as a free resource and build into their curriculum, because they've got a fair amount of flexibility. It's not like at the high school level where it's much more regimented. And so that's my thought, is if we can find ways to get that message through people that will be active promoters of it because they are scared and they want to help and they want to make better and they don't want anything bad to happen to their family, that is a really effective way, I think, of getting the message out. So carrot, stick, and you end up with a so your original question was around those two programs. Ultimately, those programs exist not to canvass the whole United States in wildfire prepared homes, and fortified homes. We run these programs so that when there is a bad day, like Hurricane Sally, and you have 20,000 plus houses in the path of Sally in lower Alabama, and the loss ratios on those houses is much smaller than the houses that are not mitigated, you have just demonstrated the value, irrefutably demonstrated the value of that mitigation. You have lowered the risk, and everyone knows risk has a price. When you lower the risk, the price comes down. In this case, it's the price of your insurance.
I have an observation and then a question on this. So there's building to code, and then there's building to code plus, because this is what you're doing is an enhancement to the code. Right. Specifically for wind and wildfire. So how much more expensive is it for a builder to build to this code plus? And then what does that translate into an increased price of the house? The reason I'm asking is if we think about the demand coming indirectly through the buyer, mm-hmm. How much more am I willing to spend for a house that's wildfire resistant? I think I'm just curious what those numbers look like.
Yeah, so let me give you the wind side, because we have start there, and then wildfires is a little bit of a different beast. But yep. On the wind side, if you're building to so there's 3 levels on the wind side. There's a roof level, and they build on each other. So there's roof, and then there's roof and openings being windows, garage doors, the gable end vents, that kind of thing. And then the 3rd level is gold, which is roof, openings, and structural integrity. Now, what's involved with structural integrity? You're basically connecting the roof to the walls to the foundation in a way that can resist the pressure that the wind brings to it when it gusts. And so you transfer the loads down through the roof, through the walls, into the foundation, into the ground. So nothing resists the wind. You're just moving the pressure somewhere else. You accomplish that with ties, metal ties, hurricane straps, things like that. It's not expensive. You just put them in the right place and the right number of them fastened in the correct way. That's a very simple thing and an inexpensive thing to do. On the garage doors, you would be required to get a high pressure rated garage door. If you look, I'd encourage anyone that's watching footage of the aftermath of a tornado. Look at the houses and look where the garage door is missing. And look at the roof that's directly above that garage door. I guarantee you, in most cases, that roof is gone. And the reason for that is the garage door fails at maybe 50, 60 miles an hour because it's not designed to withstand high wind. And you have just punched a hole in your house. Your house is now a balloon. And the wind is blowing into that garage and it is pushing out the walls. Meanwhile, and the Bernoulli effect, which is what, he gets the planes in the air, is working on the roof and it's pulling up the roof. So you've got pushing out the walls, pushing out the ceiling, and pulling up on the top of the roof, and it pops the roof. All because the garage door wasn't sufficient. And for $300 or so more, you could have had a pressure-rated garage door that would have withstood that. Instead, you've now got a big problem, which is a missing roof and a missing garage door.
So you're making me think about over-engineering things versus engineering just enough so that it can last for a little while, with the vulnerable parts cheap because we weren't planning for these rare events. The United States, when you look at things from the 50s, right? Things that were built in the first half of the 20th century, they're built to withstand a lot of situations. And we're all MBAs, right? And in many ways, business school trained people to engineer things just enough for a set of events that don't always include the extreme event. How are you thinking about that in terms of this need to change so that the vulnerable parts, as you just described, I've got a new version of the beginning of The Wizard of Oz in my mind as you speak, right? Where they're forensically looking at the garage door and this sort of thing from Dorothy's house in Oz. But seriously, how do we get into that in a way that can change how we engineer things? It's a long question, but really it's a short prompt in the end.
So in the wind space, it is much more deterministic. It's engineering, it's math. Load on a building is a function of wind speed, and then how have you constructed the building to withstand, to deal with those kind of loads. You can measure all that stuff and you can design wherever you want. Mm-hmm. We design for high-end hurricanes. Mm-hmm. Now, we're not designing for a direct hit from like a Hurricane Michael. Right, mm-hmm. A direct hit right there on the coast before it's even had a chance to slow down. Most hurricanes do slow down by the time they get to the building stock, unless they're right there on the coast, because the minute it touches land, it starts to lose its energy. So the hurricane kind of slows down. So most of the impacts that you see are in that kind of like 100 to 130 mile an hour range. And that's kind of the sweet spot that we operate in. We have a safety factor because we are engineers. Well, I'm not an engineer, but the engineers have safety factors in there because on a bad day, the math isn't going to hold up to what the actual conditions that you saw. So they'll put a safety factor in what gives you that buffer above the design level. And that's how they go about setting how much resistance there is. Now, on the wildfire side of things, it's a lot different. Say it's the pass fail, and there if you're we can't do justice to it here today, but if you go on wildfireprepared.org, not .com, you'll see exactly what's required there. But if it comes down to this, you are removing vulnerabilities. So vulnerabilities are things that can catch fire. Mm-hmm. So, and the one big one, which goes back to your, how do you persuade people to do this? Mm-hmm. One big one is you create a buffer around your house, a non-combustible buffer, 5 feet. Nothing in that 5 feet can be combustible, because when embers float through the air and land, hit the side of the house, or they land in that 0 to 5 range, they're just going to burn out if there's nothing there. But if there's a boxwood there underneath the window, and enough embers get there to ignite the boxwood, and the boxwood puts up flames shooting up that then cracks the window, and the flame goes through and catches the curtain, and the inside of the house is gone, then the whole house is gone, because you had something in that 0 to 5 that an ember got its hands on. Right. And that's why it's a pass-fail. You've got to do all of that. So the 0 to 5 is a big one, and then there are things you need to do with vents to stop embers from getting into the vent. You can go to various levels, non-combustible siding, that kind of thing. So, it comes down a lot to, on the cost side of things, what materials do you want to use? Do you want to just move everything that's combustible, plants, etc., just move them 5 feet out? That would be what I would do if I had the space to do it. The plants would probably grow better if they're away from the side of the house, right? You're going to get sun on all sides, and you don't have to water the side of your house. You could actually water the plant.
But this goes back to the point you've made about adoption, right? About what can get, and I want to actually relate it to your mention of middle schoolers with that 90% and smoking. You've talked about bad days and buffers, Alister. Bad days we're very bad at thinking about. We don't usually build for bad days. And now you're saying build buffers. So beyond Smokey Bear, beyond even carrots and sticks, in a moment where right now there are public figures saying, if there's such a thing about as climate change, well, don't worry, we do things best in America. Answer over. You're saying there's an open question about how we're going to do things in America, in every community, in every one of the states you're mentioning. So how can help us think about, is it the middle schoolers? What could we do? Just let's do the what if instead, and imagine for a moment that within this decade, the United States, I'm just going to focus on the United States for a minute, and we can apply this to any other part of the world, is going to become a little more like Japan when it comes to earthquakes. We are going to incentivize, we're going to use all the carrots and sticks to enable ourselves to build in the right places in the right ways so that we're not just every few months having these horrific news stories, maybe even every few weeks. Can you give us what does that world look like and how do we get there for a moment?
Yeah, so the code path is whack-a-mole because there are codes can be written and adopted at state level, but the story doesn't stop there. Just because you've adopted a code at the state level does not mean that all the code jurisdictions, the municipalities, the counties, etc., within the state have adopted. So some states, and I won't name them, you can go look on IBHS.org, look up Rating the States. It's one of our premier products, and we rate the states according to their code adoption and enforcement. It's quite enlightening. It's a good read. Too. The media loves it when we point out some of the states that have some homework to do. But so you've got that, like, have they adopted it, and then have they put the resources behind it to enforce it, right? So that's the long road to get all of that. That's why my job is safe for a while. But on the other side of things, and people, I don't know how they think about the insurance industry. The insurance industry is basically gamblers, right? They are taking risk and seeing how it plays out. And on a good day, they make money. On a bad day, like the campfire, they lose a boatload of money.
Cut to blackjack table to Alister's right. Yes, go ahead. Alister's right.
I mean, it's a little bit crass analogy, but they are in the business of pricing risk. It's the risk that MIM is going to have sorry, pick on you here, Mim, but the risk that Mim is going to have an automobile accident. What is the probability of that, given all the factors we have, information we have about her? Well, it's the same on wildfire, for example, right? If a house is mitigated and enforced so that you have a certificate that says IBHS gave you a wildfire prepared home certificate, well, then you've just affected the risk. And at some point, couple of things could happen. And I don't speak on behalf of any individual insurance company in general. I'm just making a general observation here. It's based on business background. Is if I'm in the risk-taking business, I get to select my risks. So if I'm in the insurance industry, I'm about risk selection. So what are the risks that I want to take that turn into insurance policies with a promise to pay out under certain conditions? Right, that's my business, is selecting those risks based on geography, based on codes, based on da-da-da-da-da. At some point, the effects of climate and the lack of action on the part of local, state government may lead me to say, you know what, I'm not really interested in taking those risks for houses that are not mitigated. Someone else can do that. I'm not interested. And what happens in that case is the state, well, it's not actually a state entity. It's a not-for-profit entity that is established by state law. I think I'm correct in saying that. And it's called the FAIR Plan. It was originally designed for, after the riots that happened in Los Angeles, to provide some coverage should that happen again. They only cover fire and riot. That's what the FAIR Plan does. It's very expensive, and the coverage is not very good. And the customer service is not gold standard. So your option in that case is, if you haven't mitigated, what are your options? You're shopping for a company that's going to insure your risk that you haven't mitigated so that your mortgage holder, if you have a mortgage, is satisfied that you've got enough insurance in place so when there's a bad day, they don't lose money. That's the stick side. The flip side of that is I communicate with my policyholders and I say, I'm really interested in houses that are mitigated. If you go ahead and get that, there's a good chance that I'll write you. So it's an invitation rather than enforcement and both can be true at the same time.
So a couple of things to follow up on that. My understanding from when we spoke earlier is that not every house can even be mitigated. Like if you have an old house, there are these older structures around. It's actually quite difficult to mitigate some of that for a 100-year-old farmhouse or an apartment building in some parts of the country. So that's sort of the first point. The second point would be that because of warming temperatures, the wind drop in speed for hurricanes, it is actually getting smaller. Like your point about hurricanes lose power when they come inland. There's an article I actually read in preparation for this. They used to lose about 3/4 of their destructiveness when they moved inland. Now they're losing about half because they're warmer. So like every 7 degrees Celsius increase in temperature lets the air hold 7% more water vapor.
Yep.
So they're able to like kind of take a fuel pack with them for longer and move it inland more, which is a lead up to my second question of like, shouldn't we be thinking about climate vulnerabilities in a broader way if we know that these storms can like move further inland and do more damage in places that we don't traditionally think of as being vulnerable? So like your job is really safe, like because there are way more houses potentially at risk.
So let me answer the second question first, then I'll come back to the first
Yeah.
one. There is good news on this on the geographic coverage of mitigation, and my favorite state comes up again, which is Alabama, and they're not the only one. Other states have done this too, but what they do is they sell an endorsement for your policy. It's a very small endorsement, doesn't cost a lot of money. But what that endorsement does says, when we, insurance company, are going to pay to replace your roof, the endorsement will pay for the upgrade to a fortified roof, which is a great way of, over time, getting adoption without a homeowner having to stick their hands in their pockets and pull out a bunch of cash, which we know won't happen. I don't know many people in the average walk of life who have personally paid for a replacement to their roof, absent a check from the insurance company. 30% of the asphalt shingles that are sold in the United States are bought by the insurance industry. 30%. The good news is that these endorsements are available away from the hurricane coast. So in the whole state of Alabama, you could get that endorsement. And that's a way of spreading to proactively combat some of the effects of climate change. So the insurance industry deserves recognition for doing that, because there aren't many examples, especially at the government level. Your first question was about some of these older houses. Are all houses able to be mitigated? And the answer is yes, but. And the yes is, if you have the will to do it, you can do it. You can retrofit. So we have 2 levels in the program. One is the base level, and that is designed for retrofits. It's 98% of the building stock, right? And houses that are ready built, you can retrofit to the base level standard. And that's the big thing is the 0 to 5, that buffer around the house. You've got to have that. Combustible siding, wood siding, things like that, that's okay. Because what we're doing is we're mitigating against the chance of ember ignition. And ember ignition doesn't typically happen on the wall. It happens down at the joint of the wall and the ground, where they can accumulate and then start fires there. So you can do the existing stock base level, gives you a degree of protection from embers. If you're doing a new build, you can build to the plus level, which protects against embers, direct flame, and radiant heat. So it's all 3 of those. You could retrofit to that plus level, but that, to your point, man, that's pretty expensive.
Right. It would
because
seem so. Yeah.
You have to replace windows, you have to replace siding, and not many people are interested in doing that.
Maybe I should allow the fire engine sound that I just muted
It's on
because
brand.
it's appropriately on topic.
And that's another thing that I don't know that people really think about is um, if you're in the fire service, your primary job is not to protect structures, it's to protect lives. And given the limited resources that firefighters have, your house is pretty low down on the priority list in a big fire. So you really are kind of on your own as far as mitigating your risk. But you got to realize what it is, and you got to figure out, how do I pass the test to get a passing grade? And how do I do that? You read MIM's syllabus, every single word.
I love this. So our takeaways, folks, are when it comes to fire, read the syllabus.
Okay, my students, if you're listening, you heard it. It's not just from me. Okay.
But seriously, as we bring this to a close, I want to try to pull out some takeaways, and just there's a few big ideas that you're really making us think. And we do this thing when we're workshopping innovations and startups, where we train the folks involved in doing the workshop. Let's say they're working on their prototyping and testing or something like that. And we say, they're used to being in a situation where when they're helping a peer, they're supposed to say something nice. They're supposed to compliment it. They're like, oh, you did it great. We try to train them that if you like it, if you like what they're trying to do, you poke holes. Excuse me. If you like it, poke holes. If you like it, push at it. If you like it, find all the problems you can find, right? And it's been this strange thread through what you've said, Alister, as we've talked about, the sensitivity of saying this state's doing it well, this state isn't, that we're driven by pride in how we have done things, but maybe we need to place that pride not in where we've been, but in what we do. So if we could just use that as a frame, we want, and whether it's the United States, where you work primarily, as I understand it, or another, we want to be proud, right? How do we take that pride and put it into the way we treat homeowners, the way we deal with regulation, the way we deal with communities? I'm really curious. If I want to be the proud municipality, what do we do?
You familiar with Bowling Alone, Robert Putnam's book?
Yes,
The
sir.
demise of I look after my neighbor, I enjoy time with my neighbor. That's what's going on. The pride of I am no longer a problem to my neighbor because I have mitigated the risk of wildfire in my house. And so the chance that my house is going to catch fire and then ignite your house is a lot lower. And I'm very proud of what I have done for my community and my neighbors.
So just like the image of an Amish firefighting community where folks, right, we don't have mechanized firefighting, so we all come together to save the house. We need to apply that image to how we prepare for fires, for storms.
We live in communities and we act as individuals.
It's the tragedy of the commons. I mean, you're trying to invert the tragedy of the commons in what you're doing.
You're bowling alone.
Yeah.
But what I appreciate about what you've just done is it's not just, oh, well, forget about it, there's nothing we can do. There are so many examples, starting with that Amish community trying to put out a fire without mechanized tools, right? There are so many examples of how we have been successful at being a community. I think what makes this challenging is that it's changing circumstances, right? And it's a risk pattern we haven't seen. It's not on the sample path that we've been used to, even if we're seeing it a lot now. So how do we form the community practices for this new reality that we're in and that is accelerating?
The pace of adopting frameworks that provide for mitigation across the states is accelerating. So I paint the picture of bowling alone to say that's how individuals, I feel like, all too often perhaps think about the use of their scarce resources to doing something to help a greater cause, right? That's the bit. Meanwhile, insurance commissioners, governors, and others are looking at the benefit of mitigation in states like when Hurricane Ian came in, the new building code, which is almost fortified, performed really well. It was another proof point. And then they see what happened in Hurricane Sally with the severity and frequency of claims there. And so these proof points kind of come together, and it's shifting from I'm going to be a leader in my state and put in place legislation that allows for insurance regulation that allows for recognition of these programs. It's gone from being the leader to I want to do that too. I don't want to get left behind. And I'm saying that a little comically, but it's true, because I see states like Missouri and others, they're putting in place legislation to allow charting the path towards this type of program. So there is some acceleration there.
And with that said, let's close with a word to that middle schooler or someone who cares about a middle schooler, right? Just as the 90% talk to their parents about smoking risk, what would you say to that middle schooler or that parent who cares about their middle schooler? If you could say one summary idea.
Wildfire mitigation is not hard. You can teach your parents.
As it happens, 63% of our listeners are middle schoolers. That's a fake fact, but everything else we've done here is true. Alister, thank you so very much for joining us. You've taught me a lot, but also given us some things I think we can use. Thanks for being on What If Instead.
Thank you for inviting me.